Welcome to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll. In this episode, we're going to talk about the most serious pandemic of the 20th century, the flu virus that started in 1918. It's estimated that about 500 million people, which was about 1/3 of the world's population at the time, became infected with this virus. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide, with about 675,000 deaths in the United States. This was 10 times the number of people who died in the First World War. In December 2018, the Journal of the American Medical Association summed up the situation by writing, "Medical science for 4.5 years devoted itself to putting men on the firing line and keeping them there. Now it must turn with its whole might to combating the greatest enemy of all, infectious disease." Our guest on this episode is Dr. Justin Olmstead, an associate professor of history and the director of history education at the University of Central Oklahoma. Dr. Olmstead gained his PhD in history from the University of Sheffield in England, and he's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a member of the International Society for First World War Studies. He has presented at national and international conferences on leadership and diplomatic and foreign policy. His newest book is Britain in the Islamic World, Imperial and Post-Imperial Connections, and his previous book was The United States' Entry into the First World War, The Role of British and German Diplomacy. We're so glad to have you back on the show. Welcome, Dr. Olmstead.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really truly enjoy being here with you guys.
You are one of our Hall of Famers. This is your third appearance on the show, and we've always appreciated that.
Yeah, I don't know if that speaks well of me or not, but I'll take it either way.
Well, to get started talking about the worst pandemic of the 20th century, later on we're going to talk about maybe some parallels with what we're currently living under. We're recording this episode in May of 2020, so many of our listeners are probably, whenever they listen to this, they may still be under quarantine or experiencing the effects of the coronavirus. I wanted to ask, when and where were the first cases noticed in 1918?
The confusion. Everybody that works on First World War history and today does the same thing. The number of checks that I've written that say 1914, 1918.
Oh, wow.
I have to go back and go, oh, wait, no, it's 2018. And I know for some of our listeners, they'll be like, what's a check? I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, with dating stuff. So to answer your question, though, it really kind of depends on where you believe the flu began. Okay, so there are essentially three competing views on this, right? So there's the first one, and this is the one that I tend to lean towards, and this is that it started in Etaples, France, right? So this is a small town in northern France. It's spelled, Etaples for people that are trying to look it up, and the E's got the little accent on it. So Etaples, France. The second place that is people are discuss the flu starting is at Camp Funston in Kansas, and this is pretty much present day Fort Riley, just outside of Manhattan, Kansas. And the third place is China. Okay, and now one of the interesting things about this discussion is that the Kansas connection and the China connection are many times put together. Okay, so there's an older story that there were two missionaries that made their way from somewhere in China and came back to Lawrence, Kansas, which is where they made their home, and they ended up running into the troops that were meeting in Fort Riley, which Fort Riley is kind of it's close to Manhattan, but it's still fairly close to Lawrence. And that's how it got started, right? So that's the China/Kansas connection. There is a part of the Kansas connection is that there is in Haskell County, there were these reports of this strange virus that acted like the flu, but wasn't quite the flu, and was really deadly, and that kind of filtered away and then came back. Okay, so for about 20 years, this was the last 20 years. So what's that, from about 1990 to now? This has been the general theory that Kansas is where this all started, if you will. But there are biologists and some historians that didn't quite buy that this whole thing started in the middle of the United States. And there are two guys in particular. One guy's Professor Douglas Gill, and the other one's Professor John Oxford. And they're both British, and they work together. And again, one's a virologist, so he studies viruses, and the other one is strictly a historian, and they kind of mix and match what they do together. And they started looking back over the British military records, and in particular the records of doctors in the British military. And it started in 1914, and they start moving things forward, and they start seeing signs of what we would connect to the 1918 flu in about 1916 in Etaples, France. I mean, the doctors are noting all these strange deaths. Okay, on the Western Front itself, they were seeing the same kinds of things. There were lots of deaths that looked like the flu, but it didn't spread like the flu yet. So it was, if somebody got it, it was pretty deadly, but it wasn't, weren't passing it as quickly as it would later on. The other strange thing that they noted was that the flu was not going after the folks it normally went after, right? It wasn't going after the old people or the young people. It was hitting young men in the prime of their lives. So folks from 18 to 44 years. And I know that a lot of people will be like, wait, 44, that's not young, prime of your life. But I'm telling the listeners that may disagree that 44 is still young. So again, we've got a very deadly flu that's not really infectious at the time. Now, I think it's a couple of things to share. One, I think it's important to note that, at least in the United States, the flu was not a reportable disease at the time. So if somebody came down with the flu, they didn't see any reason to really document it or think about it too much, other than they would, anything else, right? They responded to the flu like they did the regular seasonal flu or hay fever. Some people, even when this 1918 strain of flu started hitting, there are reports where they would say, well, this person had a heavy cold, right? So it wasn't just a regular cold; it was a heavy cold. And so those types of things were pushing the early notices, if you will, the first time they started really noticing it. Now, one thing that I do want to throw in, only because I just think it's kind of neat. So this connection, right, of somewhere in China, this might have started. That was a strong enough part of the historical record, right? So we went from it happened in China to nope, it was Kansas, to now, well, maybe it was Etaples, right? So for a long time, China was where people looked at it. And there's an author, his name is Max Brooks. He's the son of Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft. He wrote the Zombie Survival Guide and World War Z, right? So in World War Z, if you've read the book or even watched the movie with Brad Pitt, it starts somewhere in China, right? They don't have a location somewhere in China that this occurs. And part of the reason that's important, if you will, is that Max Brooks is incredibly good at attaching historical detail to his books, to the point that he does some work with the U.S. government and the U.S. military of connecting things from today to things of the past, right? To put things together. So, I mean, this, again, history making its way into the movies and literature that we get to watch and read.
Wow, cool. Thanks for mentioning that.
Sure.
So why was this virus called the Spanish flu at first? Is that the name that sort of stuck to it for a while?
Well, so again, that depends on where you're at. For us in the United States, right? We have to remember the United States is at war at the time the flu breaks out. Most of Europe's at war. There are several other countries that are involved in the war as well around the world. And all of these countries, because they're at war, see anything that might pose a threat to morale or pose a threat to war readiness as dangerous. And so none of the countries at war wanted to report that they were having this strange, flu virus that was, killing so many people or sickening so many people, because they thought that it would hurt their people's morale and maybe give a boost to the enemy. In Britain, they had the Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA, and that made it actually illegal to discuss the flu because it could damage the war effort. the the reason it ends up getting called the Spanish flu is because Spain is neutral during the war. And so they are the first country to publicly announce that they're having problems with this virus.
Oh, wow.
And it really starts to make the press when King Alonso VIII comes down with the flu. And so now it's definitely in the press. And so it was very, this is a Spanish thing. And in fact, it's interesting because ethnocentrism and xenophobia are just as rampant then as they are now, or at really any other time in history. And the British said, well, of course Spain has the flu, and Spain started this flu because look at their climate. It's hot and dry, and it's, and it has these issues, and Spanish hygiene practices are horrible. And so this is why they're spreading the flu. So they called it the Spanish flu as well, or the Spanish lady, which was the other name for it. The Spanish, on the other hand, called it the French flu because they had a lot of guys that were a lot of Spanish people that were traveling into France to do work and then coming back across into Spain. So they would claim they were bringing the disease in from France itself. The Germans, they called it the Russian pest. So it was for them a problem. And the Russians, they blamed it on the Chinese. So in Russia, it was called the Chinese flu, right?
Holy cow.
So from our perspective in particular, so anything that's going to be written in the English language, published in English-speaking nations, the Spanish flu is what it's going to be known as. But in the other countries, they would also have to add these other connections to it.
Huh. That's fascinating. So did people start to kind of recognize the severity of it? Were the numbers really increasing by like spring 1918? Is that kind of where we would date the beginning of it too? So
in some cases, this is where I get to say, we've not learned anything from history. Because I think I've mentioned earlier, the first impact really is seen in 1916. This is the first time that it's really spotted in Etab. But in 1918 is when it mutates and becomes this really communicable, highly infectious disease. So it's had the opportunity to adapt, right? Which, if we think about modern times with the COVID-19 we're dealing with, it's already highly infectious. And if it adapts, then it just becomes even more terrifying. But so for the folks in 1918, they'd seen it already for a little bit and then watched it become highly infectious later on. The first wave really hits in May or June. So if we're believers of hot weather that takes care of of viruses and so forth, the 1918 flu is one that says maybe you should take whoa there pickle. Let's think about this a little bit and look at the history of this. I think the historians generally count the first soldier being documented ill was in March 1918. That they're really, we bounce to the highly infectious aspect of that. If I can make that split between what the doctors were finding in 1916 to when this thing really takes off. So March 1918, then the flu really gets going in May or June, possibly April, depending on the accounts you read. Just to talk about what they saw, and it's maybe bouncing ahead, I know, but the British Grand Fleet, right? The Royal Navy ends up having about 10,000 sailors admitted to sickbay during May, June 1918. So they're seeing soldiers coming down with it. Now, of those 10,000 sailors, only 4 die. There's a French army post that has a little over 1,000 troops that has 688 troops hospitalized. So, 68% of the post is hospitalized for the Spanish flu in 1918. About 5% of them die, so like 49 die out of that group. But it's still right. This is a huge amount. So they're seeing soldiers die, but it's to call it, just to ask about how serious they're finding it. It's more of a nuisance, if that makes sense to them, because 688 people hospitalized. Well, they're not dead; they're just sick. And so if you're a general, this is a complete nuisance. I can't defend or I can't attack because half my guys are in or in sick bay, if you will. I think about the 22nd of May, 1918, is when we see the alarm bells really start to go off in all the countries, and then they really start trying to figure out ways to minimize the risks of the time. The second wave was much more deadly, and was the spike in this and their pandemic, right? So the first one we saw as a little bit of a bump, and then it really jumps. So May, June is the small bump we talk about. September to November 1918 is when deaths start to skyrocket. And if we think about, the number you started the podcast with, 675,000 Americans die from this. In October 1918 alone, 195,000 Americans die from the flu.
Wow.
That's a huge chunk. And again, just to reiterate, the important part that was freaking out the medical establishment at the time was that about 50% of the victims were young, men or women in the prime of their life. It was not attacking the young like it normally did. It wasn't attacking the old like it normally did. It was young parents, school teachers, nurses, soldiers, these folks that it was very atypical, if you will, that they were dealing with. And I think the other thing that kind of freaked out the medical establishment and scared people was the way people were dying. It wasn't this that you got sick and you died in your sleep. It was blistering fevers. It was nasal hemorrhaging. It was pneumonia, all brought on by the flu. And it was causing patients to essentially drown in their own fluids, right? Their lungs are filling up. And that's why, some of the coughing that people would hear and talk about at the time.
And the speed that it took place in, the rapidity of the disease was terrifying. I know I've read stories of 4 women sitting down to play bridge one night, and 3 of them died before they ended their bridge, but during a bridge game, showing no symptoms at the beginning. Do we know why? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, there was an aspect of this idea of someone could, look fine in the morning and be dead by the nightfall because they had contracted it and had moved. So that speed terrifies people.
Do we know why it targeted young people more than younger or older populations?
I think there's a couple of things, if you will, that go with it. One, there is a theory, at least, that the young people somehow missed an earlier pandemic, or an earlier strain of the flu. I think it was 1898. I think that's 1889, 1890, some of that range through there was a strain of flu that hit most of Europe anyway, and made its way around a little bit the world. It wasn't a pandemic, but a lot of people got it. And that was, at the time, was known as the Russian flu. And they think that somehow the people that got hit by the Spanish flu somehow missed that, right? They didn't develop the antibodies, or they developed the wrong antibodies. So it was a completely different strain of the flu that their body just couldn't cope with. Is the only things that I've read on dealing with that.
Is it fair to say that circumstances surrounding the war, or the war effort itself, kind of contributed to the spread of this pandemic? Having soldiers closely packed together, or other people traveling long distances, did that maybe make this a worse pandemic than it might have otherwise been?
Hard to say that it made it worse than it would have been, but at the same time, I mean, yes, right? I mean, it is you're transporting people all over the world. So just like today, the fact that people travel so much makes it very easy for viruses to spread and make this a pandemic. So when the Spanish flu hits in 1916, 17, 18, and definitely that spot in early 1918, we're in the middle of a world war. And so you have people, again, U.S. troops that are heading to Europe, and then some coming back from Europe. You have people within different national groups from within the British Empire that are coming from India or China, was shipping people to Europe to help as well, right? So you have Indians that come, you have colonials from African nations that are being brought up to Europe as well. So it's easy to make this spread just by the number of people that are coming back and forth. Like you said, there's mainly young men, massive amounts of them that are crammed into military camps, that makes it very easy for this stuff to spread as well. So yeah, I think that plays a huge part in the spread of the pandemic.
What was happening in kind of the timeline of the war in early 1918 when the pandemic started to really affect soldiers or the war effort?
So in the First World War itself, by 1918, well, if you go back to the first podcast I did with you guys, I'll remind you that the moment that Germany fails to knock France out of the war in 1914 is the moment they lose. Okay, they cannot fight a drawn out war. So by 1918, Germany is a defeated nation in all but actuality. Right, they are going to lose this war. They have knocked Russia out. Right, so you remember that the Germans smuggled Lenin back into St. Petersburg. He helps lead the Russian Revolution, and the Bolsheviks take over and withdraw Russia from the war, giving up this huge amount of land to Germany in 1917, which frees up all the German troops fighting Russia that they can now throw into the French, British, and soon-to-be American lines as well. Again, the United States hasn't got troops there at the time yet. So this spring offensive that was known, as the Kaiserschlacht, or you'll see written as the Ludendorff Offensive, is launched mid-May by the 21st of March 1918, and it's completely spent by the 18th of June. Okay, so the Germans made some moves, but they couldn't knock the French and British out of the war. Okay, there are reports from the German lines that there's this wave of the influenza that robs the German army of about 500,000 troops. There's 500,000 troops that are in sick beds that can't fight. And in fact, Ludendorff who's one of the German generals at the time, is known to have been complaining about the fighting spirit of some of the troops and that they weren't fighting as hard, they weren't pushing like they should. Part of that's just because they're exhausted, but part of that's because a lot of them are either sick or recovering from being sick, and so they couldn't move too much from there. But I don't want to say the German offensive fails simply because of influenza. The British and French are feeling this effect of the flu by May and June as well, and they were able to stop the offensive. Okay, and so when I say that July 1918 is when the offense has petered out, and November is when the armistice is signed. So it's not very long after that. And I think it's important also to note that at this time in Germany and the other Central Powers, the British blockade has cut into the food rations that are available. This means that there are civilians that have increased malnourishment. This means that the poorest in Central Europe are more susceptible to diseases. And there are some estimates that you can find where about 209,000 German citizens die in 1918 alone from the flu. That's on top of other non-combat fatalities, and that number jumps to another 400,000 that gets, and again, depending on what historian you read or talk to, that number is up or down a little bit as well. If we think about the United States, the United States has joined the war. They are looking to raise money, right? Because we don't have a full tax system yet. I know Wilson implements a tax during this time frame to help pay for deals, but the United States is still asking the American public to loan them money to pay for troops, to pay for uniforms, to build ships and so forth and so on, right? And so you guys will remember this as Liberty loans, or in the Second World War they become victory bonds as well, or war bonds. And you see places like Philadelphia that even though they have cases of the flu and they know it's going on, they decide that because of the war effort, they want to support it and that they want to make sure that they raise the money to help the country. They decide to go ahead and have their Liberty Loan parade. And within 72 hours, so what's that? 3 days, 4 days, 72 hours, virtually every bed in the 31 hospitals in Philadelphia is full. Okay.
Wow.
So let's see. So that parade was on the 28th of September, 1918. By the 5th of October, there were 2,600 dead Philadelphians due to the flu. Okay. Now we can fast forward to the 12th of October, when another 1,900 plus die from the flu in Philadelphia alone. And so in a span of about 14 days, 4,500 citizens of the city of Philadelphia die, and because of the flu, which was spread in large part because of this parade, right? They were able to, it just went through the crowds on the streets. And as bad as that is, it got worse. So we see over 6 weeks from this 28th of September on, 6 weeks on, 12,000 Philadelphians die. Right? And during that 6 weeks, there was one day that where 759 Philadelphians died from the flu. In one day.
Wow.
It was so such a panic in the city, and that they could not keep up with things, to the point that priests were driving horse carts through the streets of Philadelphia, calling for the residents to bring out their dead. I mean, this is like the scene. Was it Monty Python, where the guy's ringing the bell, pushing the cart, bring out your dead, right? Only this wasn't a skit. This was real life. This was Philadelphia during 1918, not during the Black Death of the 1300s. So, yeah, maybe I don't know if I went a little sideways on your question there or not.
Oh no, I mean, I think I had also read that Armistice Day celebrations in many places contributed to the spread of the flu, right?
Yeah, so Armistice Day definitely didn't help in many cases. There are some cities that cancel. Right, they've already said we're not going to have a parade or anything like this, but there are other ones like Denver, right? So Denver was seeing a decline in the number of flu deaths when November 11th came about. But they decided to have an Armistice Day parade anyway, and that led to a resurgence of the flu in Denver. So that happens here and there as well.
Huh. Kind of going back to the war just for a minute. Was there ever any suggestion or suspicion that this was a biological weapon that was infecting people?
So I have not seen that anywhere. I've not seen where this is some sort of conspiracy theory that we're dealing with on that one. I don't want to say that necessarily people believe the government more, because there was pushback at the time, and there are more people that still believed in some conspiracies. I think that the shock the medical community had over this pandemic, we take that and we tie that to the fact that you get the first chemical attacks in warfare in 1915 on the Western Front. Okay, and then as 1916 hits, and the British doctors are doing all of these medical autopsies to figure out what this disease is that people are dealing with, and they're noting in their medical notes here that some of these soldiers that are killed by the flu, they're describing the heavy damage to these people's lungs as something that reminded them of what they had seen through chemical warfare. Okay, so I think that there might be some people that are taking that medical, it's a medical journal. A doctor wrote this, but they're pulling it further than it should be. It's a comment so people can understand how bad the lungs are damaged, but not meant to be it's a false connection. I think that was being made. But you know what? Here I get it to an extent. Anxiety pushes conspiracy narratives, and I might even go as far as arguing that the fact that so many of these countries designated the virus by a foreign name, right? The Spanish flu, the Russian pest, the Chinese flu, the French flu, that that makes it that much easier to believe that maybe this was some sort of biological chemical weapon that was being used and it kind of got out of hand. Again, much like we hear of today, we have a lot of issues with China right now on a number of different fronts. The United States does, and so it's very easy to point the finger with one more thing.
Well, also related to the war effort, was there a shortage of doctors and nurses on the home fronts around among the nations that were fighting the war?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Maybe contribute to the severity of the spread of it.
Sure. I mean, think about in Great Britain, about 60% of the country's doctors and nurses were in northern France with the military. So that's going to impact how well they can deal with things. The United States, there was also a severe nursing shortage where, again, most nurses were shipping out to head to France. Making it a little more local, maybe for some of your listeners, in Oklahoma City, what they consider the first confirmed flu case was on the 26th of September, 1918. And on that same day, there were 10 doctors and nurses that were sent from Oklahoma City to San Antonio to join the war effort, start getting their training to head to France. And those are 10 doctors that are not going to be in Oklahoma City to help as the city begins to fight in the coming days and weeks at the time. Now, that being said, and while clearly these people I'm going to talk about are not doctors and nurses, but there are a number of, when schools got canceled, teachers, we didn't have the technology for them to teach from home. So school just got canceled. People got sent home. And there was a huge amount of teachers that volunteered. And again, most of these are women that volunteered to work with the Red Cross and other organizations to help with the flu and influenza issues in the United States, because they knew that so many doctors and nurses were elsewhere. And when we're talking about, there were teachers that were sent around to homes to teach people how to clean with Lysol and other disinfectants to help try and stem this disease as well.
Wow. How would you characterize kind of the initial responses by political leaders when the flu began to spread? Did political or military leaders have a role in reacting to this?
This would be one of those instances where I would say that maybe we don't learn we should from history. I just recently read this fact that I thought about when I was thinking about doing this podcast. We talk about living memory. Okay, so when you learn from history, generally that is done within living memory. And I say generally because there's somebody that'll take some issue here or there. We learned this from history, that from history, and it's taken a long time, right? But living memory is only considered to be 90 years. So from 1918 to 2020, we've eclipsed the 90 years. And so some of the mistakes, if you want to consider mistakes, I'm not trying to be political by any means here at all, but if we have mistakes that are the government or any government in the world has made, there's some of the same mistakes that were made in 1918, right? So we look at we have nations that are at war, so they're attempting to control information. We see some of that today as well, across the board, all nations. You see these nations that are trying to minimize risks while at the same time hiding real data about infection and mortality. And this leads to ill-informed citizens. And if you're ill-informed, it's easy to have increased fear and increased distrust and distrust in your leaders. So people at the time, because they were not getting any strong messages from their leaders, whether it's federal, state, or local government, you get these people that don't know how to deal with the virus. That does, despite the teachers that are volunteering, it makes it difficult to find volunteers to care for people because they don't know, how to protect themselves, much less how to take care of other people as well. A couple of examples, if you want. The U.S. Surgeon General at the time, again, Rupert Blue, initially said there was no cause for alarm if precautions were observed. and that was in September. And then by mid-October, he still ends up saying that, if the I'll quote this. I've got this written down because I like the way it's written, if you will. Here, the Surgeon General says, if the present generation they've been so spoiled by having had expert medical and nursing care readily available, right?
Spoiled, okay.
You're spoiled because we've had this stuff. You should, not have to deal with these kinds of things. You should be able to deal with these on your own instead of worrying about what the medical people are dealing with. President Wilson wanted to keep troop transports moving. So there were, high numbers of infected and sick soldiers going back and forth across the Atlantic. And I mentioned some of the laws, the DORA laws in Britain. The United States had passed the Sedition Act in the United States. So these sedition laws prevent printing truthful stories about the flu that might or could be considered as undermining the war effort. Okay. Another example at Kansas City, and Kansas City is not that far from Fort Riley. We're still talking about a close proximity. And leaders in Kansas City tried to calm the public and telling them don't worry about it. It's okay. Don't worry about it. And that's about the 26th of September. And within by the 7th of October, so again, just a little over a week maybe, Kansas City is having to close all their schools and the churches and the theaters because the flu is hitting them. But they didn't close them for long. And once they started reopening, the flu then again, spiked and started to spread some more.
Do you think maybe at all due to the war effort, was there maybe a heightened sense of we're all in this together, maybe a sense of nationalism in the way citizens approached this or reacted to it? And I'm curious if 100 years ago, was there a greater sense of trust in experts or scientific opinion than there might be in our reaction today?
So yes, I think there was a greater trust in experts and scientific opinion. That is what. So I'm going to backtrack. Americans have a long history of disregarding experts and scientific opinion. Yet there are times in our history when we tend to believe them more often than not. So, while some would say that we're currently in a dip, a low spot where we don't believe any experts or scientific opinion, that's just the way American history has gone. We believe what they say, and then suddenly we don't, and then we believe what they say, and suddenly we don't. And this is again a generalization, I know, and it's about the vast majority of Americans. I think. The war was considered popular, yet there's a huge number of Americans that don't support the reasons the United States is joining, so they're not really encouraged to do anything to help the war effort. They're not going to be anti-war, but they don't want to be pro-war either. The idea that maybe we were the Americans were in this together. No, I don't think so. I've thought about the question before, and now sitting here again talking about it. We think about there were 3 waves, maybe 4 waves to the 1918 flu, and every wave was passed off as seasonal flu to begin with. Right, so you still have leaders that are saying, "No, I don't want to. We're not going to take this." We do have pushback. I've mentioned that, and I know we'll probably talk about it more in a little bit. We have Americans that don't want to be quarantined. They don't want to wear their masks in 1918, just like you have today, right? So there's not a whole lot of it. There's some. We've seen advertisements from people to not use their telephones because they may be needed for a medical emergency. So don't spend all day chatting. And you may remember, I don't know, I date myself here, but early phones were party lines. It wasn't you'd pick up, and if someone was on the line, you waited your turn. If it was an emergency, you had to ask them to get off the line first, and if they didn't, too bad. Or if somebody else picked up before you could click the button, you started to ask them to get off the line. So there's still a little bit of pushback at the time. Overall, I think Americans generally try to help each other. I think that was as true in 1918 as it is today.
So this might say more about my own level of historical knowledge or reading, and I'm glad to have a World War One, an internationally recognized First World War expert here to talk about this. In my own reading about the First World War, I recall maybe a sentence or two, a paragraph here and there talking about the Spanish flu. Obviously, the war itself has received an incredible amount of study. Do you think that the pandemic has been studied by historians as extensively or as effectively as the war itself?
I think that most books that are focused on battles probably are not going to. Most high school textbooks are talking about the battles. They're talking about troop transports, and so there may be a section, right, maybe a paragraph or 2-3 paragraphs that deal with the Spanish flu. If you get into actual, academic scholarly books, definitely since the start of this century, you have more people that are writing books on it, and I think that if we look at people like John Barry, he wrote The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. He's doing tons of interviews right now as well because, well, it makes sense. This is his book. In fact, his book, John Barry's book, is the book that former President George W. Bush read that scared him to the point that he went, when he got back to the White House with this book, he gave it to some members of his administration in the Homeland Security Department and said, "This happens every 100 years. We need to be prepared for it." And so he starts, at that point, creating this national strategy based on John Barry's book. Right. Wow. So again, there's a plug for history and making a positive difference for our current times. Nancy Bristow is another excellent historian. She has an excellent book out called American Pandemic: The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic. And I've seen several interviews done with her recently as well about this. And there's a couple other ones that are out there. Catherine Arnold has a good book. Alfred Crosby has a good book on it. And someone maybe a little bit closer to us, George Daner, who's at Wichita State University, which is a mile from me and just oddly enough, just 2 hours from you guys. He has 2 books that deal with the flu, right? Global Flu and You, and A Century of Science and Public Health Response. And they're not specific necessarily to the 1918 influenza pandemic, but they definitely work on how the flu has influenced issues in the world. And so he's somebody that there's 5 people I've just listed right there that do some work on it. So I think so in the early 40s and 1950s, maybe the 1960s, not a whole lot was done with it. You would see some, I agree, 1 or 2 lines about the flu in books about the First World War, but in more recent time, we've definitely seen historians taking this on and doing more and more good, brilliant work with it.
Thank you for mentioning those books. We'll put some information about them on the webpage for this episode too. You've talked about this a little bit already, but what were some of the interventions that citizens in 1918, 1920, what were some, I guess the CDC now calls them non-pharmaceutical interventions? You mentioned face masks. Were there other interventions of this kind that the population generally tried to practice in response to the Spanish flu?
You know what? It's really as simple in 1918 as it is today. Social distancing, quarantining, wearing masks, and hand washing were the prescriptions of the day. I'll point out, and I don't know if I skip ahead on any questions you have planned or not, but there was resistance. We go back to your question a minute ago, even of did we all pull together? There were hyper nationalists that patriots and politicians and journalists even that suggested that this disease so resembled the common cold that they objected to public health measures that infringed on their freedoms or that would infringe on the war effort. In fact, the Anti-Mask League was started in San Francisco, California, of all places. And and their complaint was that this infringed on their civil liberties, right? And then I know that I saw a sign, come across my social media of people recently saying the same thing, that this is my social media, or my liberties. And there were other groups in places again like Seattle and Denver and Phoenix. Overall compliance was high. A lot of people were willing to wear the masks. We didn't have the N95 style mask at the time. And we think about surgical masks at the time were made of gauze, right? Gauze, porous. It's worse than any of the cloth stuff that you can pick up today, I think. But that was a surgical mask at the time. Women were encouraged to wear veils, if you will. I mean, fine mesh with chiffon borders on them, and they became known as influenza veils.
Wow.
Well, and so this is some of the same stuff that they're looking at. There were people that poked holes in their masks so they could smoke with the mask on.
I think I've seen that on Twitter just yesterday, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There were businesses that were worried about that people would shop less if they had to wear a mask just in public. And so they were asking the governments, to not require masks to be worn out. Let individual businesses make that decision, but don't make it a law, was kind of one of the arguments that was being made. And there were, again, like these anti-mask leagues and other people that were just known as anti-maskers. They claimed that masks just gave people a false sense of security. And it was the government, their slipshod directives that, did little to convince the public about what was needed. So why even wear them? Okay, they're done. We're not doing it. So that is some of the issues they had. I find it interesting. There are laws today about wearing masks in some places. In 1918, some cities and states put laws in about wearing masks. You had to wear a mask, or you could get fined. There were possibilities of prison sentences being handed out if you didn't wear your mask in public. In fact, some of it was public shaming, right? So if you were caught not wearing a mask, your name was printed in the paper as somebody that was not wearing a mask.
Wow.
Supporting things. But, again, it wasn't uniform. So, and I forget, I think it may have been California. Again, there was some city leaders that were caught, on a photograph, not wearing their masks together. And they were given very light fines, because they had to be. Whereas, common guy on the street was not just fined, but in some cases they had to be put in prison as well. So that gives some of the issues that you deal with it. One of my favorite stories, just because it's so out there, is that there was a special officer for the San Francisco Police Department who got into an argument. This may sound familiar to people here, right? They got into an argument with somebody because they refused to wear their mask. And so this police officer pulled out his gun to threaten the person to put on a mask. And the argument got so heated they ended up shooting the non-face mask wearing person, and in the scuffle also shot 2 bystanders. Right?
Holy cow! Yeah.
So we, again, we've seen people, right, that in Oklahoma that have been shot for not wearing masks, or asking people to wear masks. And hey, here it was happening still in 1918, 1919 as well.
Man, what was going on in San Francisco in 1919? This is
they've always wanted to do it their own way, I guess.
Yeah. Do we know much about what conditions were like in cities when they were shut down? It occurs to me that citizens of the day didn't have the internet, they weren't able to stream Netflix. As you mentioned, schools couldn't do remote schooling necessarily. Are there maybe primary sources or historical accounts of how citizens reacted to this?
Yeah, you can find there are newspaper articles, there are magazine stories that have been done, and there are some stories you'll find in some of the books I mentioned as well about this time period. People are during quarantine in 1918, 1920 about like you'd expect them to be. They're bored, they're lonely. Some of them worked on sewing. They had these grand plans like we all do today. I want to get all these things done, and suddenly can't force yourself to, I can't read anymore, can't do different things. But, sewing and cooking, people were, trying new things. And we look at, today, flour sometimes in a shortage at stores. I have a colleague whose daughter loves baking. And my colleague's like, I can't get rid of the food. I have, every day she bakes 2 or 3 more, pastry treats, and we're all going to get fat having to deal with this. Same essential idea at the time. Reading newspapers, magazines became very popular at the time as well. There were magazine newsstands that couldn't keep them on the shelves because people were buying magazines so quickly. Some people tried to talk on the phone when they could, right? Despite the guidance to try and stay off as much as possible. Bookstores remained open in many areas, and they saw a huge boom in their business as well. Jigsaw puzzles, again, just like today, were
right.
a lot of fun. People went with that. And I think just like today, the human psyche needs to deal with things other than just absorb it all. So there were lots of dark jokes about the flu. There was gossip and there was speculation, and there was this they needed their community. They needed that human connection, and that was causing problems. And just like today, that lack of community outweighed a lot of the fear of the virus. People wanted to go out to be with each other, and if again, some of the misinformation, if this is really only a 3-day fever, or if it's really only a heavy cold, then I'm willing to take my chances with it, kind of an idea. I know when the COVID-19 first started really hitting the United States recently, my daughter, who is a sophomore in college, she referred to it as the spicy flu. But we just call it the spicy flu because it's just a little bit more spicy than the regular flu.
Huh.
I don't know, but I think she's changed her mind a little bit on that. But so you think about this community issue, right? So in cities and rural communities, there's instances of both. It was not just people out in the middle of nowhere that didn't have connections, or it wasn't just these big city slickers that don't have a sense of community. It was across the United States in particular that people starved to death because there were people that were afraid of the flu, and they were afraid to bring people food, and they were afraid to these people were afraid to leave to go get food, and so they ended up starving to death in their homes.
Wow.
There are some instances of neighbors or family that would come to people's houses and bang on the window and shout at people in the house just to make sure that they were okay. And once they got a reaction, they left. And that was the extent of that social interaction that they dealt with. I think the saddest part about all that is that the bits that I've read on it, there are a lot of survivors that say that things changed during in communities during this pandemic, and when it was over in 1920, people just didn't seem as friendly as they were before. They were a little more standoffish. And again, this isn't universal, but there's just a lot of survivors that talk about this. And I think again, from the historical record, where public health officials, where public leaders exhibited strong leadership and were proactive, people maintained faith in one another. When there was, a hodgepodge of information and people didn't act, or they acted late, a lot of people died. I think those are the communities you see more people withdraw from each other in.
Wow, fascinating. I have been curious what you might, from your studies, I've been curious how we all will react when things do get back to normal. And I sort of imagined that people would be maybe more positive, more wanting to connect with other people. But maybe there are some lessons from the wake of the 1918 to 1920 pandemic that would prepare us for a different experience, maybe, or
maybe. And I think you might also look, at the SARS or some of the other things we've had in recent years. Again, if this comment comes across political in any way, it's not intended that way. But you look at places like Hong Kong and South Korea and Taiwan, which have dealt with the COVID-19 outbreak better. Part of that's because of their experience with SARS and some of the other, swine flu that they dealt with. They were already wearing masks. They had masks available. I think that you're going to see a lot of people, the nurse at the school I taught at years ago, she refused to shake hands with people. She said, as a nurse, people's hands are the most disgusting things on the planet. I'll do an elbow bump, but I'll never shake your hand. And, people kind of laughed about it, but we got used to it. And I think you're going to see, some people that are going to, by gosh, I'm going to go back to shaking hands. And some people that'll just say, I'm going to stay back. I think you'll probably see more masks being worn. I wouldn't be shocked if you see more and more people wearing masks. Some of them, I don't know if you've seen any of them, but some of them are getting quite trendy.
Yeah.
it might be something, be a new massive fashion statement. Maybe.
Right. Huh. Well, also looking ahead to our own near future, I wanted to ask about, were elections affected by the pandemic in 1918 to 1920?
Yeah, to some extent, they definitely were. Right. So a couple of things to remember. One, President Wilson had a massive stroke in April 1920, and so he was not running. He couldn't run anyway because he'd won 2 elections, but he couldn't help his Democratic replacement, if you will. So you have Ohio Governor James Cox, who is running, and Warren G. Harding, interestingly, also from Ohio. I think it was just very interesting that the 2 presidential candidates from Ohio at the time. Harding's call for his return to normalcy, right? That was his calling card. In fact, in all the history books, right, the 1920s and under Harding are a return to normalcy. That made a lot of Americans feel better. That made a lot of Americans think about, oh yes, because I want to go back to things before the flu, before the war, and again, to wherever you're at, whether you're poor or wealthy, whether you're a business owner, a big business owner or not, I mean, that has different meanings to each person, but there is some comfort in it. And again, Harding also is an America First, that, a lot of his campaigning was, let's put America first. Now we've gone to help Europe. We've, came back with the flu, and a lot of American dead. Let's go back to return to normalcy and put America first. I think that you see rallies and speaking events during the war that get barred. There are a lot of candidates that seek out newspaper coverage. They start sending more campaign literature in the mail to people because they can't do the big rallies anymore. Warren Harding returns to his small town, and I forget the name of his small town now in Ohio, but he essentially ran a campaign from his front porch, and newspaper reporters, gathered outside and would ask him questions from the sidewalk. There was I saw it quoted as a modern day selfie line, if you will, started with people lining up to have their picture taken with Warren Harding on his front porch at this time frame. I think because of some of this, and again, this is one of those spots where we can say, the more things change, the less things change. There were candidates that accused public health officials of trying to influence the election by limiting turnout. There were, voting that was going to look different depending on the part of the country you were from. So in California, there were some polling places that couldn't open on election day because they simply did not have enough people to operate them. Everybody was too sick. They were in bed at home or in the hospital or dead or dying.
This was in 1920?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. There is the 1918 election, right? So there is the midterm election that people would deal with here. And there was, interestingly, there was little to no public discussion about postponing any of the elections. People, this is what we do every 2 years. We vote. 4 years for the president and Senate. We move on for this stuff. It's generally, I think, again, from the reading I've done on it, it's generally believed that the 1918 election in particular, the United States is still at war, and there is a sense of civic pride that is so high that voting was seen as a necessary act of patriotism by those that are not, actually, with the military or the government fighting. So So even then though, right, only about 40% of voters turn out in November 1918 to vote. I say only about 40%. What I think the last election we had, 32% voted. So
right.
I don't know.
The more things change, the
more they stay the same. But again, sadly, and this is the thing, again, we saw in Wisconsin recently, in the aftermath of the midterm elections, there was an increase in flu infections and an increase in deaths. So it's still, people wanted to get out there and do it. However, and it was a risk that they're willing to take. And some of them pay the ultimate price to vote, to do their democratic duty, if you will.
So do we know much about conditions in Oklahoma during the 1918 to 20 pandemic?
Yeah. For the most part, I had to make myself not be glib there. We know that Oklahoma reacted much like the rest of the nation. Okay, so we have churches and schools and businesses that get shuttered, streets become empty, but then hospitals filled up as well. There were temporary facilities that had to be set up to deal with the sick. Just like today, there are a lot of people that claimed that the flu, which was a seasonal flu, it wasn't anything special. This was the usual. Was it the grip? I think is what my grandmother called it.
Yeah.
This is the grip, and that was what it was called.
Is that a French word? I've seen it as la grippe, GRIPPE, I think.
Yeah, it might. Maybe that's the origination of it, but I don't know. I should know that my grandmother was a kid. My grandmother would say, "Oh, I think I've got the grip," and sort of hacking, coughing, and stuff she dealt with. But I mean, this was using that as an explanation for. It's not really the Spanish flu. I mean, I mentioned earlier that every wave was dismissed by some folks. The Choctaw communities in Oklahoma were hit hard. There are accounts from the Choctaw Nation record that so many people passed away so quickly that there were not enough coffins to use to put the bodies in. In Tahlequah, the numbers I've seen, and I'm sure the Cherokee Nation has this, they can substantiate this or they can add to it if someone wanted to look for it. But my understanding is that something like 21.4% of the Cherokee Nation died to the flu at the time frame. So that's a huge amount of people. And again, you look at today, you see these reports of so many of the Native American tribes in America that are being just destroyed by COVID-19. Not much has changed, if you will. I can say that when we looked at the first confirmed case in Oklahoma, which I mentioned was the 26th of September, by the 1st of October, there were 5,000 Oklahomans that were confirmed sick with the flu. Within a week, almost all the emergency hospital nurses in Oklahoma City were sick with the flu as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And it turns out that they did some research on that, and they had been visited, interestingly, by a group of Army doctors and nurses from where else but Kansas earlier in the week. And so we look at that transmission, if you will, across. I see. I think so. About a week later, things seemed to be. There weren't as many sick, and Oklahoma City leaders thought the worst was over. This was going to, everybody made a big deal for no reason, and they, they thought, again, this whole idea this was just a bunch of strong colds. It wasn't the flu. There was no need for a quarantine. Look at the kids; they're fine. But again, in Oklahoma City, shortly after that, funeral directors started running out of coffins. Florists were running out of flowers. Right? Oklahoma City itself was seeing between 15 and 40 deaths a day during the first week that the pandemic hits Oklahoma City.
Wow.
I've read, and I love this little anecdote, if you will, but the much like today, you hear all the different. Well, here's what you need to do to stay safe. You need to do X, Y, or Z. And in Oklahoma City, whiskey was the most popular remedy. And part of that is because of the prohibition laws. Whiskey was allowed to be dispensed by pharmacists for medical purposes.
Wow.
And there's this run on whiskey in Oklahoma and everywhere else as well, to the point that the price for whiskey jumped to $18 a quart.
Holy cow.
Now, if you want to know what that number is in days in 2020, that would be $234. $234 for a quart of whiskey.
Oh man!
Yeah,
Purely for medicinal purposes too.
purely for medicinal purposes. Yeah.
Wow. We had an interesting article in one of our recent Oklahoma Humanities magazines about the original state flag design of Oklahoma, which was, some of our listeners are probably familiar with it, a red flag with a white star in the middle with the number 46. And for several reasons, that design was abandoned around this time. One of the reasons that the author of the article suggests is that there were red flags that flew outside the houses of people who where people were kind of marking the house. Someone who lives here has the flu, so a red flag began to be associated with not just communism at that time, but the flu itself.
Well, I've seen red placards that were supposed to be posted in people's windows that said, people in this, please stay away. This house has somebody that's been sick and so forth on it. And I've read where like white scarves or white things were held out in some parts of the country that was to be tied to your doorknob or flown outside your house to alert people that someone is sick in there, and that then to please check on them in the future, if you will. And I think a couple of things for listeners to watch for. I know if anybody's on Twitter, there are a number of people that are great historians and virologists that are doing all sorts of threads on the flu as well. I think Christopher Nichols from Oregon State University has quickly become one of the big names that you see on Twitter and elsewhere. He's getting pulled into a lot of interviews with newspapers as well on the 1918 flu as a historian. The Middle Ground Journal. And again, I'm associated with them, so this is a bit of a plug. But starting this Friday, there's going to be every Friday a series of articles from historians and graduate students, even on the different aspects of the flu. Like there's going to be something about how how sports dealt with the flu in this time frame. And,
wow!
Teaching. Online teaching information people can use about the flu as well. So there's lots of things out there for your listeners to go and pull if they don't want to get one of those great books that I mentioned. These are some of the other options that they can look at.
Oh, great! Thank you for mentioning that. We'll put links to that information on our website too. It occurs to me I should have asked about sports. How were sports affected in 1918 to 1920?
Yeah, so just a bit. I know I'm waiting for the article to come out on the Middle Ground Journal.
Oh man, I can't wait to read that.
But we know that like initially a lot of stuff was shut down. Baseball comes back. You can find pictures online of baseball players and umpires wearing masks.
Wow,
as they played. There were complaints about, oh my gosh, they're limiting gatherings to no more than 20 people. That means that OU football is done for the season. We're not going to be able to watch OU. And that was across the nation. The big football programs, people and college communities that live and die by their college football teams were distraught because the seasons were canceled or the threat of a cancellation of a season was going on. But initially, again, most of these places were closed down because they're trying to social distance and quarantine things. When they opened up too quickly, people can go to a football game, but I don't even, what's the stadium at OU? How many does it hold? 60,000 people maybe?
Oh, now it's like over 80,000, but back then I'm not sure.
Yeah. But so, if you look at, that's a lot of people that are going to get put in a small area that can transmit this disease amongst each other.
Well, I've interviewed enough historians to know that this is not a great question to ask a historian necessarily. But I do want to ask, are there things we can learn from the 1918-20 pandemic that might help us in our recovery or our experience as this is ongoing in 2020? What are the lessons we can learn from what we're all experiencing now?
So I think two things, right? So again, our new phrase over in the last 2 to 3 minutes, the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. we're 100 years on, we are in the same boat as our ancestors. Okay, we live in a world of infections. But I think there are 2 infections that were eliminated in the last 100 years or so. And even then, I think one's come back. I mean, smallpox was one, but we've seen, with the anti-vaxxers, we've seen smallpox come into resurgence. So this is our life. This is what humans have to deal with every day. We know that the communities that acted the fastest, right? Those are the ones that save the most lives. So clear, honest, rapid, coherent leadership from the federal, state, and local level. That's essential. We know that from history. We can take that and put that over us today and move from that. Confusion generates fear. Fear costs lives. Okay. We know that the cities, states, and countries that implemented everything at once, social distancing, masks, quarantining, hand washing, these places had more survivors. That's as true in 1918, 19 as it is in 2020. Okay, we know that the countries that went from no handshaking, but you can still kiss each other on the cheek. I mean, that's ridiculous. No handshaking, but you can elbow bump. Well, slightly maybe better. Now we're going to social distance. You wear a mask. The folks that took the stair step, they have a lot more COVID-19 infections, a lot more deaths. The communities that said, nope, we're doing it all. You're going to quarantine. You're going to social distance. You're going to wear a mask. You're not going to touch each other. They've seen, more survivors, if you will. So I think that, and we should also expect there to be a second wave, possibly more deadly, and which I find, terrifying, and maybe even a third or fourth wave that we know. As you said at the beginning, of the podcast, or maybe when we were chatting before we got started, we don't know what things are going to look like in the next 6 months. UCO plans on meeting face to face to begin with. For how long we do that, who knows? But whether we're all going to be wearing masks, whether we're going to be having smaller class sizes, however that works to try and limit things, we know these things are going to happen. We just have to look back at these, all these things, hand washing, quarantining and stuff, and follow those directions.
Thank you for mentioning those. That's about the part where I'm ready to wrap up, but I know I had other questions that I'm gonna have to put them aside. But are there some other things from your research that you think would be important to mention in this episode?
I think because we are Oklahoma Humanities, I do think I want to mention a couple of things about Oklahoma.
Oh, great! Yeah,
we can fit those into our time frame.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we don't have a time limit at all. I just
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll go back and ask that question then, because that was one of the questions I was going to throw at you.
Okay.
Let's see, where was that? Okay. Did you see? I'll probably edit this out, but did you see how the Bundesliga came back over the weekend?
I did see that, and I saw that. So the Bundesliga put in a stipulation that no fans could show up at the leagues, and so many of these fans, these ultra groups, and these rabid fans that have been showing up and watching practices from outside the stadium as much as they could. The teams were begging them to not show up for the matches, because the rules are that if fans show up, you automatically take a loss.
Wow! I didn't know that.
To, go home and watch it. Do what you can to watch it elsewhere, but we don't want large groups of people getting together.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. The yellow wall in Dortmund is no longer.
Yeah.
Man, huh? Well, man, this was great. Thank you so much. This is an incredibly good episode. I'm so glad to have had you on here. Thank you very much for coming on, Dr. Olmstead.
I'm glad you liked it, and I'm glad that you feel like it was definitely worthwhile. So,
is there anything that you would like to mention about anything that you're working on, or we don't have to, do anything like that? But if you'd like to plug anything.
I've been doing a lot of work recently on alliance building and the Churchill-Eisenhower relationships. So a lot of stuff on that. I've started doing some work on protective security, which is, if you will, irregular warfare. So protective security, you think about the pillars in front of buildings so that trucks can't drive up.
Yeah.
These kinds of things. So I'm doing some work into that.
Have you studied the new federal building in Oklahoma City?
Some of the guys that I'm working with at UCO and at Coventry University in England have used the new Murrah building as one of the examples of what was wrong initially and how they've been trying to do things correctly now.
Wow. Huh. Yeah. Have you visited that building ever? Or been around it?
I've been there before. I have to go back and take a closer look at it now that I'm starting to do more of this work on protective security. So.
Man, that's fascinating. Wow. Yeah. It is. I just remember reading about it when it was first opened, all the incredible extra measures that were included there. Man.
Yeah. So yeah.
Well, thank you again to Dr. Justin Olmstead from the University of Central Oklahoma. Really appreciate your comments on this episode. You can check out the BrainBox website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Moreva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. So this has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.